Hello and welcome to another tutorial for Introduction to 3D. Kim Edwards speaking. So today we're going to start off our Introduction to Photoshop texturing, and you just need to open up the wooden planks start file, and what we're going to do is we're going to turn this image into three images, one for color in a material, one for bump mapping, already done with orange, and one for specular mapping, which we've also done with the orange. So the first part we're going to work on is just breaking up the image, and we'll make a bump map. So step one, we're going to just use the marquee tool, which shortcut is M over in Photoshop land, and it's this one here. To basically isolate the gaps between the planks. Incidentally, underneath these tools in the toolbar of Photoshop, there are other ones there that you can cycle through. So if I press Shift M rather than M, I'd cycle through my different marquee options. If I need to get to more, I can just click and hold down. Okay, so let's get started. So over here we've got our layer window, and Photoshop just works very much like the traditional animation setup under a rostrum camera with planes of glass that has got image information on different layers, and one layer goes on top of another layer. So what we're going to do first off is make a marquee selection just by clicking and dragging until it looks like it fills with the marching ants. The gap between the first plank. And then down here in the layer window, there's a little button here which we'll use quite regularly, which is where we can make some new types, different layers. So here we can click on a solid color or a fill layer, and this brings up a color swatch, and I'm just going to choose, it's going to make it green to begin with, just so I'm really clear where my lines are. We can change this after effect with these solid fill layers just by double clicking on them. And what's controlling where the actual green is actually a separate image, a black and white image called a mask that we're going to use just extensively. And that's this one here. So this, I've got one layer, but I've got two parts to it. I've got the actual part that is being shown, and then the mask that's controlling what's being shown. Black, if I alt click the mask you can see it, black means hide and white means show. Great, so that's our first one done. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to use the move tool over here, shortcut V on the keyboard, and I'm going to hold down the alt key on the keyboard and drag down a few copies of that to go over, and if I hold shift it'll snap it horizontally to go over my other things, my other gaps. I want to make sure you've got the auto select tick box on, so when I click on a layer it selects it. So now you can see over here, I click on this one, it selects that one, so it's automatically changing the layer selection down here depending on where I click with that option on. Sometimes you want it on, sometimes you don't. In this case we want it on. So I can just repeat that. I'll pause it just because that'll be boring. Okay, so I've finished copying all mine across. Now the next thing we can do, some of these I haven't got right on the money. Just give me a second, I'm going to remove that icon. Okay, so what you can actually do is with the move tool selected again, I can actually select the layer that I'm interested in adjusting, which is this one here, and actually use the up and down keys, arrow keys on my keyboard to do fine adjustments. If I hold shift I can do bigger increments to the adjustments, but this is a kind of quick way just to kind of line things up if they weren't perfect the first time around. Let's go through and make sure they're sitting roughly in the right spot. Great. The next thing we're going to do is to make our many layers here a little bit more organized. We're going to use just Shift click to select all those layers and put them in a little folder or a group. So if I just press Ctrl G, puts all of them in a group, and we're going to label this group just by double clicking on it. Something fairly logical, which is going to be step 1, define gaps. Oh, caps on. Okay, that's done. So next thing we're going to do is we're now going to define the planks. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the eye symbol that's next to each layer, which basically hides the layer. Turn that off, and I'm going to use another tool, which is the Magic Wand tool, which is this one here, and shortcut for that's W. Photoshop's really good. It's easy to learn the shortcuts because you just hover over them. It tells you what they are. So basically this makes a selection based around tolerance for a color that you've clicked on. In this case we're clicking on gaps, so it's going to do a good job. I click between the gaps here so that I can now do solid fills for each plank. Okay, so click in there, and then you guessed it, I click on solid color, and I'm just going to make these varieties of grey with a value range in brightness. So this is the hue, saturation, it's value. In Photoshop it's called B for brightness, just to be a little bit different. So we're just going to do different shades between the values of, say, 55 and 25. So I'll make this one the brightest, the darkest, 25. And then go through and do another one. So this time I'm going to make it 40. Okay, and so just get you to go through and do all of them like that. Okay, so now that's done, we're just going to repeat the process we did before and select all of these and group them together and label that step 2, fill planks. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to crop this image, because if this was a repeating texture, which it may be in the end, you can see here there's no gap for up here. So if this was repeated, there'll be no gap up there. So we're going to crop this image as a result. So I'm just going to get you to use the marquee tool again and drag the left selection down so it's just below your green layer. Instantly you can zoom in and out with a range of different ways to do it. I like using Control Plus on the keyboard, and that's pretty okay. It's not perfect. So I think it's good enough for our purposes though. So I'm going to just go to image now up here in the menu and go to crop. We've now cropped this so that our image is an improvement. And in actual fact, I think I will quickly fix that. So I'm just going to go to history, which is another great feature, history, and just go back one step. And I can now fix this. So I'm going to adjust it by right clicking and going to transform selection, which will allow me, let's say, to transform the marquee that I just made. Yeah. And I'm going to do it by clicking up there to say transform from this point out. I'm actually going to just put 101 in here in terms of height. Yep. And it doesn't really help me, so I will zoom in and just make sure it's bang on as best as possible. Great. And then I click on the marquee. I want to apply the transformation. I do. And zoom back out again. And I'll go image, crop. Great. Okay, so that is now done. So the next thing we're going to do is the first group that we did in step 1. We're over in step 4 now. We are going to make a copy of this group and change them from being green, because we're going to use them to darken the gaps between the wood. So to duplicate it, we'll select the group and drag it down here onto this page icon, which makes a copy. And now we'll just move it by dragging it up to the top of the layer stack, and we're going to call this step 4. Fill planks group. Soften planks. Excellent. So we've got a copy of them now. I'll hide the other one. And the first thing we'll do is we'll merge all of these layers by just using select and using layer merge layers. So the shortcut, as you can see, is Control E. So I'll use that instead. Great. So now we've got an actual layer that we can't change. There's no solid, it's not a solid fill that we can double click. But what you can do with something is, with layers, is if you press Control and click on them, it makes a selection based on transparency. So having done that, I'm now going to make a new solid fill. And I'll change the value of that to be 35. Excellent. Now I don't need this layer, so I'm going to drag that one down to the bin icon to get rid of it. And now we've got another solid color that we can adjust. Now what we want to do is I'm going to just soften these. These are very sharp, the edges. So I'm just going to blur them a little bit. So up in Filter, you'll see there's a blur menu, and in there there's a blur called Gaussian Blur. And I'll get you to blur that mask with a radius of 3.4, and it gives you a nice zoomed in preview of the result. So that's before, that's after. Click OK. And so that's just going to have softened the gap that we made before. Alright, the next thing that we're going to do, so our step 5, we're going to make a copy of this layer to sit underneath all other layers. So I'm going to make a copy by dragging into the page icon, and I'm going to delete the mask on this one just by selecting the mask, delete, and drag that all the way down. So with nothing in between, that's what we've now got. And you can see that that's softened up quite nicely now. Good-o. So the next thing we're going to do is this is going to form the basis of our bump map. So white pushes out, 50% grey, or middle grey does nothing, and black pushes in. So we're going to actually make a copy of our original image just by dragging and duplicating, and dragging that all the way up to the top here. And we're going to put it in a new group, so Control G for a group. And we will just label this group Step 6, just image. Okay, and then on top of this layer here, we're going to add a adjustment layer. So one we're going to choose is black and white. So these layers work by doing a bit like a blur filter where it affects things. This one's affecting color, and it applies to everything that's beneath it, and it can also be masked. So I'll get you to just choose a preset I've got here, which is high contrast red filter. And that's going to brighten everything and leave some dark bits in there on this group. The next thing we're going to do is we want to make this group interact with the layers below it. So we're going to use blending modes. Okay, so I'm going to change this to multiply. What this does is it multiplies the values, so every color in a digital image has got a value. It's best to think of it as black being 0 and 1 being white, And in this case, the multiply blending mode is simply just a multiplication operation. So it says top pixel is multiplied against the values below it. So effectively what that means is that if black is 0, anything multiplied by 0 equals 0. So the black parts of the image that you've got on top with a blending mode of multiply, the darker parts of the image come through and the brighter parts don't. So that's good. So now we're pretty ready to test this in Maya. So I'll get you to save out 2 files. One file is going to be a working file. So it's got all the layers that we can come back and adjust, and that's really normal practice to have a layer that you can go and a file that you can fix up. And then we're going to save out another file just for Maya to read, just to preview, because we're going to test this the texture. So save as, and we'll get you to call it Wooden Planks Part 1, and we're going to save it as a TIFF file. TIFF file is a file format that's not specific to Photoshop. It can be opened by other programs, but it also saves all of the Photoshop kind of information. So layers, the masks, any adjustment layers and things like that. So it's a good format to use. So we'll save the master that way. And then we'll save out another copy just as a JPEG file, which is a compressed file format, which doesn't have all the layers, so we can't go back and fix it up. And if we saved it again, we'd lose quality because it'll compress it again. And just call it Wooden Planks Step 7 Preview.jpg. Save. Okay, so with that done, we can now open up Maya. So in Maya, we're going to test our bump texture on just a plane. So over in the polygon tab here, I'm going to click on Create Plane. And the size of it I'm getting from the proportions of the image before. So I'm going to make the width 30, and make the height 18.98. Okay, and that marries with the dimensions of my texture file in Photoshop. So make sure I've got the Show Texture swatch on and Toggle Viewport Renderer on. And then we'll assign a new material, a blend material. Just turn off the grid. So assign a new material, blend material, which you should be familiar with. I can see it's shiny. And then I'm going to get you to click on the checker swatch here. And click that open, and from the Create Render Node menu we'll choose File, and what it does is, because we're making a bump map, it first of all attaches a bump 2D node. I'll show you in the Hypershade just so this is really clear. So if you recall, you can select a material, right click it and go Graph Network. So it automatically created a bump 2D node, and then connected to that is the file that we're going to load in. And that is the JPEG that we saved out before. Step 7 Preview. And that's done. I'll close that. And we can see now that suddenly our texture is really shining through. It's very, very strong though. So I'll get you to go here and click on Go to Output Connection, which, if you recall, the file node was then connected to the bump 2D node, so that's the output. And we'll just change the actual strength of this with the bump depth node. So you can see here that makes it stronger, that makes it go into negative values, and so forth. So we're going to just change our bump depth to 0.25. Okay, and you can adjust as befits your image, but you can see now that gives me a nice indication of the bump, but it's not overly strong. Okay, next you can just save out that Maya file in the ASCII format, so rather than Maya binary, Maya ASCII, as Wooden Planks Step 8 Preview. Alright, that's it for this part. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. So this is our second part to our Introduction to Photoshop Texturing tutorial for your intro to 3D. So I've opened up our last Maya file that we saved called Wooden Planks Step 8.preview. And the reason we're in Maya now is because what we're going to do is we're going to make a new texture, and this one's going to control how shiny, which is that specular color attribute down here, is how shiny the wood is. And if you recall our orange tutorial a bit, like how when the orange has its dimples in it, the pushed in parts, we made a darker color in the specular color area. I'm going to do a similar thing for the wood. The reason why we're in Maya though is just to get a kind of ballpark benchmark as to what we think would be an acceptable color in terms of brightness for when the wood is its shiniest. Yep. So the gaps here, obviously we're going to use a texture to make sure are not shiny at all, and also these kind of parts that we can already see from our bump map. Yeah. So if you'll need to orbit your view so you can see kind of the specular highlights on things. My values that I found were acceptable for the specular attribute is I made eccentricity, which is kind of the spread of the specular highlight, to 0.385. And the roll-off, which has kind of a similar effect, I have 0.65. And then for the shiniest part, I made the V value in hue saturation, HSV color, I made that 0.4. Yeah. So if it was too bright, we're going to have a really super specular floor. Yeah. And this is probably where we can see our roll-off effect a little bit more and our eccentricity. Yep. So I'll just put these back to what we had before, 0.65. So specular color I had as 0.4, and that was just playing around going, yeah, if it was most specular that would be acceptable. So just going to make a mental note of that and go into Photoshop now. So over in Photoshop, we pick up where we left off in Photoshop, which was over in the Wooden Planks Part 1 file, which was our TIFF, our working file with all the layers and information that we need to edit. And to start off, just organize this a little bit more. I'm just going to group all of our existing layers together and call that bump, because essentially that was all our bump elements. Yep. And then what we're going to do is we're going to make our two solid fill layers, one that we're going to make with a brightness of 0.4 and one we're going to have as black, so it won't be specular at all. So down here again, solid color, and got that hovering there. Just pause and fix that up. Okay, so we'll make our bright one first of all, which was 40. Yep, so 0.4 in Maya becomes 40 in Photoshop. That's going to be our bright one. And then I'll make another one that's going to be our black one. And look, if you were pressed for time, we could probably make an acceptable version based just on our bump. But this won't take too long. Anyway. So great, so let's relabel these so we're clear. So I'm just going to call this bright and call this black. And then we are going to get the background image, and we're going to use that. I'm going to adjust the levels on it, similar to how we've done before, just using the black and white node. So just duplicate that and put it up the top here. Our background layer, and I'm going to group it, and I'm going to inside here I'm going to create the black and white adjustment, and we're going to use this to define just to make it a little bit more contrasty, I'm going to use this to define the bright parts of the image. Yep, so we're going to use that as a mask for our brown value down there. So we're not going to use a preset as we did last time. We're going to actually just have to plop these values in. So I had -31, and this was just from playing around. 168, -200, -159, -200, and 80. So you can see here, this has left some brighter points, yep, that are going to be the shiniest parts of our wooden plank. Yep. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy all of these together. So if we just press Ctrl+A, it'll make a marquee around everything. And then there's a command to copy everything merged together. So if I just go here, edit, copy merged, it'll copy everything that's below the layer that we're on. Yep. So I've copied that so that we can paste it into the bright mask down here. Okay, so we'll rename this group before we do that to 001. And over in our bright down here, we'll hide that, we don't need to see it anymore. And then down here, we're going to make the mask selected, and I like to make it visible. So you can toggle the visibility of the mask rather than the actual image or colors or what have you that it is controlling by just holding Alt on your keyboard and clicking. So with that selected, I'm going to now do paste, which is Ctrl+V, PC, and we've pasted that color corrected image that we just copied into here, and it's going to use that as a mask. So just clicked out from here over here to get out of that view. So you can see it's dark, but we don't want it to be, this is wood, we don't want it to be too shiny. Yep. And let's just group these two together, and we'll call that 002. I'll put that at the top of the stack just by dragging. And we're going to save this out. So first off, we'll save another working file. So save as a TIFF. And what I'd like you to do is just call it Wooden Planks Part 2. And that will be good. All very good. And then we'll save out a preview image to look in Maya. So we'll go save as JPEG. And we'll just call this one Wooden Plank Spec Preview. I've already done it before, so I'll just replace it. Okay. It's already open. That's fine, I've already saved it. Okay, so now we'll go back into Maya. So if you recall before, it was Wooden Planks Step 8 Preview that we had open, if you need to reopen. And we're going to make sure that we've got the blend material open in the attribute editor. And we're going to connect to the Specular Color attribute, that JPEG that we just saved out. So let's click on the swatch, click on File. In the image name, I will load in the Spec Preview here. And now it's using the Spec Preview that we made to control Specular. We can already see a difference. To really see it, you'll need to orbit around because it's specular, so it kind of depends on the grazing angle, whether you see the highlights or not. You can see, as we want, this is not specular at all, and there's some variety in terms of the shininess on the actual planks themselves. So that's good. That's pretty painless, and I'm sure that you're getting a hang of this now, which is great. Right, see you in the next video. Bye. Okay, welcome back. So this is part of the Introduction to 3D course, and we are doing the Introduction to Photoshop Texturing Part 3, where we are going to make a color map. So we've already made a bump map, and we've made a map for Specular Color, and now we're going to make a color map. So what I'll get you to do is open up Wooden Planks Part 2, which I've already got open, and we'll duplicate the background layer and put that at the top of the layer stack, like so. It's going to be, when there's groups, it can be a little bit fiddly, so just persist and you'll get it at the top. Okay, now I've also put a file called color reference, because if we have a look at this layer, I don't really like the colors personally. I find them a bit off-putting. So I have found a color texture which I quite like, that we're going to use as a basis for our colors. And the file is called color reference. I'll get you to open that. I'll open it in a new tab. So I quite like the palette in this one, the colors by comparison. On this one, a bit oversaturated and frankly a bit too red. So switching back to the Wooden Planks file, we'll tell Photoshop to do some color correction and level correction using that color reference image. So we will go to apply a match color operation. So if you go to image, and you need to make sure that you've got your duplicated layer selected. So go to image, and we'll go to adjustments, and we'll go to match color. And then we'll pretty much leave all of these values the same, but we want to actually specify what our source is, and our source is color reference. Great, so that's done. So I'm just going to click OK, and so now it's done its best to match the black and white points and the colors to our reference image, which we no longer need open. And you can see the similarities there. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to adjust some levels. So levels is a really common color correction operation that we use, and it's probably worth me just quickly explaining it. So we know that we've got, it's best to think of an image composed of values for each pixel that are in a range from 0 to 1. 0 is black, 1 is white. Yep. It's actually a little bit more than that, because we've actually got channels. So there's 3 channels in an RGB image where the values are from black or white, saying just like a mask for blue, or a mask for green, and a mask for red. So the levels basically allows us to say, well, if the black value is 0, we're going to remap pixel values that are not 0 to be 0. So you can see here, this has got a histogram view, like a graph view, of the amount of values that fall within a range from 0 to 1, or 255 in Photoshop. And we can say that anything that is, for example, 48 will now be expressed as black. You can see that basically darkens the image. Yep. So I'm going to make that black point 51. Yep. And by contrast, we can say that anything that falls within 196 is white, so it'll be changed to white. That's brightening up other elements. And then I can say that anything that would normally be middle grey values can be either darker or lighter. So in this case, I'm going to say they're darker, so they're 0.86. Cool. So it's just pushing color values around and giving us a nice view of how that's happening. So that's our levels done. Great. Next thing we're going to do is, I think it would be better to be less saturated. Now there's 2 saturation, so that's the intensity of color operations. There's a general hue and saturation one where we can remap the colors to different values, and there's this vibrance one here. Vibrance has got to do with the amount of color actually spilling over. You can see it's vibrance, yep. Saturation is just generally whether it's got any color information at all. So I've changed, want you to change vibrance to -21 and saturation to -59, which will saturate this, desaturate this quite a bit. Okay, so this is going to be our color, and we'll group them all together and call the group 003, and then we'll do some saving, fairly obviously. So we will save this out as Wooden Planks Part 3 as a TIFF, as our working file, which I've already done. Save. And then we'll save a preview as JPEG as Wooden Planks Color Preview to look at in Photoshop. So that is all good to go. So then over in Photoshop, we will pick up where we left off last time. So if you open Wooden Planks Part 2 Maya file, grab your, and this is where we had applied a bump and then also applied Specular Color. We go over to the blend, you can see that that's the case. So we're going to fairly obviously assign our color texture to color. Just load that in. So it's Wooden Planks Color Preview, and that will take a little bit to come in, and that is done. So we could do some adjustments here, but I'm just going to clean up the labeling of these things first of all. So we will go over to blend and let's rename that to Wooden Mat, the material. Then we'll go to the output connection, which is the shading group, and we'll also call that Wooden. Oops. SG for shading group. If you are wondering what this is, because we've come to it a few times, apart from color values, we can also use textures to control the actual and move around the geometry, and all of these feed in together in these shading groups, as well as some effect kind of attributes, so volumetric type of effects. So that's labeled, and then we'll may as well obviously relame our geometry. So if I go to the outliner, just call this Wooden Planks Geo. And then we'll save the scene as Wooden Planks Part 3 Maya ASCII. Cool, bananas. So do that. Okay, and then we're going to import into this our previous exercise, which is the orange. So our final file for the orange was orange 003. I'll put that in. And that's what it looks like. Now I don't want to have the plane shape, so get rid of that. I want everything else. So like the lights that we brought in, remember there was one underneath the ground. We had a directional light, a spotlight, and we've got a camera as well. So we'll change our, we're going to do another renderer of that, but now with our plank in there. So just change our rendering quality up to 0.5. And then we will render out this scene through this camera, which is now not camera shape 1. It's got a prefix of the file name to avoid confusion of conflicting nodes when they come in, so conflicting names. So if we just go to Panels, Perspective, RJ3, Camera 1, we'll be looking through that camera which we'd already made. and we shall click on render. Now I'm just going to pause so you're not waiting. Okay, so that's that rendered. So we'll save out that render. So we'll save as an image. We're going to save it as a TIFF. And we're just going to call that Wooden Planks Preview. And then we're also going to save out this file as another in the ASCII format as Wooden Planks Preview.MAYA.ASCII. And we are done, and our floor looks pretty cool. Right, see you next time.